Now, Europe is undergoing a major population change. That population change has to do with the fact that the founding race in Europe is now being not overwhelmed, but intruded on a continuing basis by people coming from places outside of Europe. The founding race or races of Europe, which I call northern whites, are the Indo-European peoples. They are Greek, Latin, Celtic, Teutonic, Slavic. Those are the peoples that have been the long-run inhabitants over the last 3,000 years or 4,000 years of Europe. But now other peoples are moving in. I've been talking about that, right? Moving in are what we call southern whites. Southern whites are people who are members of what we call the white race, but often northern whites don't recognize them as white. They're people that come from North Africa and Western Asia. Indeed, they're darker. And overwhelmingly today, by virtue of history, they are Muslim. And I talked about the coming into to Europe of millions of Muslims. And then the second group coming from Central and South Africa and also from the West Indies are blacks, Africans. And they're also pouring into Europe, inciting both social and political change. And coming into Europe also are Asians, mainly people from South Asia, that is from India and Pakistan, and certainly in places like England that has changed the social and political landscape. But there is a group of people who have been in Europe for centuries, who came from someplace else. And in fact, they constitute a continuing problem because they are presently migrating in large numbers from Eastern Europe, which had been their center, into Western Europe. The name we give to them in English is gypsy. And the gypsies are a problematic people. And in Europe, they are universally hated. Even liberals, when they're standing in a square holding their pockets, surrounded by gypsy children, do you understand? Lose a little bit of their liberalism. Huh? They don't say, oh, what charming little children, ha-ha, come close. I mean, nothing. They are universally hated. Even other oppressed minorities, even Muslims and even blacks in Europe have hostile feelings toward gypsies. And anybody who's traveled in Europe may have had a gypsy experience. They are a problematic people, and now they're pouring in large numbers into Western Europe. There are 12 million gypsies, it is estimated, in the world. 8 million of them, that is 2/3 of them, reside in Europe, mainly centered in southeastern Europe, the area that we call the Balkans. But there are 8 million of them in Europe, and they're on the move. The event that triggered the move happened in 1991. Prior to 1991, most gypsies lived behind the Iron Curtain. Since it was, as you know, a socialist paradise, there was no reason for anybody to leave. Why would they want to leave a socialist paradise? So the government didn't allow you to. and so you couldn't leave. The gypsies were behind the Iron Curtain. But in 1991, as you know, communism fell, the Iron Curtain fell, and now gypsies were free to move. Well, gypsies moved to Western Europe for the same reason our ancestors came to America. They were looking, or they are looking, for a better economic environment than the one they presently are in, and now the borders are seemingly open, the Iron Curtain has fallen, and since 1991 they've been pouring into Central and Western Europe. You can see them in large numbers if you travel to Berlin, to Prague, to Munich, to Paris, to London. They're on the move. And they now constitute a problem, a social problem, because what they trigger, which is the fuel of the right, is racism. Now, when I gave you an analysis, if you will, of the history of political parties in America not long ago, I referred to the fact that at the heart of the Republican Party was not an economic issue, there was a what? A racial issue. And in fact, one of the major issues on the right is the issue of defending the race. And certainly the remarks, whether intended or unintended, of Trent Lott, right, gives you evidence that for him, certainly, the major issue is not economic and was not economic. So in Europe, the emergence of racism is fuel for the rise of political parties that feed on racism. They're called the political parties of the right or the new right. Now, today there are confrontations all over the place with gypsies. The confrontations exist in the places where they had been centered for centuries, namely in Eastern Europe and in Southeastern Europe, in countries like Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Serbia. There are confrontations there because the economies aren't working, or they're not working very, very well. And there's certainly the confrontations in Western Europe because the needs and lifestyle of the gypsies moving into Western Europe do not conform to or fit into the lifestyles that have developed in Western Europe ever since the 18th century. So this confrontation continues because one of the characteristics, certainly of the gypsy population, is that it has a high birth rate. So what may appear to be a small problem in one decade can become a larger problem in the next decade and an even a larger problem in the decade that follows. Now, in order to talk about what's happening in Europe, I have to talk about the gypsies. Where did they come from? The name we give to them shows the struggle to figure out where they come from. One of the theories that started up in the 18th century, or even before, because in the 18th century people were becoming for the first time sort of scientific, and they were asking what could be the scientific, reliable sources to answer this question. One of the first theories that emerged was that since they were dark and looked different from the populations among whom they lived, that they came from Egypt. So gypsy, drop the E, you get what? Gypt. And from Gypt, you get gypsies. So the word gypsy is based on the idea that they came originally from Egypt, which is wrong. Go change a word. Actually, the Greeks thought they were connected to a heretical group attached to fortune-telling that resided in Anatolia. Anatolia today is called Turkey. And the name of this heretical group was the Athanganoi. And through various corruptions, it turned into the word that appears in German, the Zigeuner or whatever. I mean, they are the gypsies. But that's based on another what? On another theory. Wrong. And that was reinforced by the fact that the gypsies call themselves the Roma or Romani people. Sounds like Roman. Well, they're clearly not Roman, but it was clear that the Turks who resided in Anatolia called themselves by the name of Rum. So it was assumed that since the Turks were in Anatolia and they called themselves Rum, so Rum, the whole theory, wrong. I mean, what they needed to do was to look at the language of the gypsies. The language of the gypsies is an Indo-European language related to English. Where else in the world is there a large collection of people speaking Indo-European languages? India. And in fact, it's very clear that Romani, which is the language of the gypsies, comes from Sanskrit. It is related to all the northern and central languages of India. And that is the origin, because they have preserved this language which they brought with them from India. Well, how did they get from India to Belgrade? And when did they come? And how did they come? Why? Actually, the coming of the gypsies into Europe, and they arrived in Europe in the 13th century. That's 7 or 8 centuries ago. The arrival of the gypsies in Europe is also an invasion from Asia. It's the early arrival of the Indians and the Pakistanis, if you will, and it's the first arrival of this group into Europe. So having basically agreed, all scholars now agree, including the Romani, that their origin is in India. Even the Indian government has acknowledged the fact that they came from India. In fact, they could have ended up with the name that we gave to the natives here in America. They could have been called the Indians, but they were called the gypsies, the Zigeuner, whatever, and the name has stuck. So let's go back to India. India, as you may remember, is a country with a population that comes from 2 major sources. One, very dark, called the Dravidians, who were the natives of India. The other, white, Indo-European, who instead of going westward to Europe went eastward to India, or southeast to India, invaded it somewhere around 1500 BC, conquered it. And in fact, the white and dark races in India mixed. But they did not mix evenly. And out of that mixture came a system which we would regard as ethically faulty. It's called the caste system. People were divided up by color into groups that we call castes. That means these are people that you eat with and marry. You do not eat outside your caste or eat with people outside your caste, and you do not marry people outside your caste. As you go down the caste scale, it gets darker and darker and darker. Each caste was associated with a job or profession. Everybody in your caste did the same work. It served as a bond for each caste. There was certain work for very light people, like being generals and priests, and there was certain work for very dark people, and that was toiling on the land. So there was professional specialization. When the caste system began, there were only 5 castes. Now there are over 2,500. 2,500. You go figure it out. and each one of the castes associated historically with a profession. Ever since Gandhi arose on the political scene, there has been a movement in India to abolish and to fight the caste system, but it has been extremely difficult. One of the most difficult parts of the caste system is that there were certain people who were regarded as so inferior that they were not allowed to be in the center of town or to enter the temples. Therefore, they were called outcasts, outside the caste system, and their jobs varied. One of their major jobs was to clean toilets and to take care of the garbage. We generally regard those jobs in our culture as the what? The lowest. Of course, if the garbage collector doesn't show up, it becomes the what? The most important. All right, fine. So they were the toilet cleaners and the garbage collectors, but they also did other things. One of the things about the outcasts was, since they couldn't live together with the other people, some of them developed what we call a nomadic existence, right? They moved from place to place because they weren't really welcome to stay in any given place for a long period of time. They developed this wandering, nomadic existence, very much like the upper classes today. The upper classes, where are they? Are they in Detroit? Are they up near Charlevoix? Are they down in Florida? Are they in California? I mean, I don't know where they are. So, but then it was lower class. Then the upper classes stayed put, and it was the what? The poor, the outcasts who were on the move. And the way they survived, if they were what I would call enterprising outcasts. The loser outcasts, and they were, in a sense, all losers, all right? The loser outcasts did garbage and toilets. But those who were able to do better did things that were more interesting. For instance, they were the first ones to deal with something that the priests were a little wary of. They dealt with metals. So they became smiths, blacksmiths, tinsmiths, whatever. Smithing was something that outcasts did. What would happen is they would show up on the outskirts of town, and you would what? You'd go to them, and they would do the work for you, and then they might move on to another place. Sometimes we would call these people tinkerers, all right? A second thing that they did was they bred animals. Often they undertook tasks that people in the villages and the cities did not wish to do, especially in an agricultural world. So they often bred horses. And in fact, they became sometimes masters of the horse trade. That's how they picked themselves up from the bottom. They would show up as wanderers in the market. Do you understand? They would bring their horses. But the most significant thing they did was they became a wandering show. They became entertainers. They would come to one village, right, and they would be on the outskirts, and they would put on a show, and they would sing, and they would dance, and the whole thing, and then they'd get some money, and then they would what? They'd go to another place, and often what happened was they mixed everything. They did a little bit of smithing, they did a little bit of breeding, and they did a little bit of entertaining, and that's how they survived, moving from place to place. Now, we know of such a group in India today who are called the Domba. They go from village to village. You can see it. If you travel through the countryside of India, you can see these wandering groups. Many of them are outcasts who perform for the people in the villages. And if you understand linguistics, you can go from Domba to Romba, from Romba, not the Romba, okay. From Romba, you can get to Rom, the Roma, or the Romani. It seems to be clearly the case that the gypsies have their origin in these dombas. And the dombas are the entertainers that wander around. They go from place to place. They are both useful and hated. Hated because they are outcasts, and they will pollute everything, including the water. But on the other hand, they're liked because they come and they what? They perform and they delight you and they fix things. Because they were like mysterious strangers, part of their act was to assume magic power. And that magic power was translated into an activity called fortune telling. Oh. So you got this whole professional profile and how it emerged. I mean, there they are. Were they happy? Were they like kids? Oh, I want to go into the theater. No, that isn't what it was. They were a bunch of outcasts trying to what? Make a living in a world that viewed them with great hostility. So gypsies from the beginning, going all the way back, who knows, to 1200 BC in India, were a despised but useful people. Got it? Despised but useful. There most likely wouldn't have been any theater of any significance in India without the gypsies, without the domba. So why do they decide to leave? Well, they had every reason to leave, except they were attached to where they lived. I mean, their work was attached to the people who despised them. What triggered their migration was a conquest. In the 8th century, there arrived on the borders of western India, there arrived the Arabs, all fired up with a new religion called Islam. In fact, they invaded western India, but they did not have the power because they had overstretched their lines. They did not have the power to conquer it. But they conquered a little piece of it. And we know that in the 8th and 9th century, there appear in Iraq slaves, captives, taken from India into the Muslim world, some of whom were these outcasts, these domba. They were called the Zot people, and we have evidence in the 9th century that they were so numerous in Iraq and so despised that they rose up in a major rebellion which took at least 15 years to suppress. But they were suppressed. But that isn't the Romani people we know. They're most likely cousins of them. In the 12th century, the Turks who were converted to Islam now came to India. They invaded India, and they were able to do what the Arabs were not able to do. They conquered India. And having conquered India, they conquered Persia. And they conquered almost the entire Arab world. And their conquest now opened the border. Meant, since the Turks were in charge of India and the Turks were in charge of Persia, so wandering groups now sort of cross the border, and we have it in the 12th century that they crossed over into Persia. And there are gypsies in Persia. There are domba in Persia. Now, of course, they had to do a little deception in order to survive in their environment. And they were into pleasing their audience, always into pleasing their audience, because if they didn't please their audience, they were what? They were finished. So they kept their old Hindu religion in secret, and they what? Pretended on the outside to be Muslims. You can call them Iranian Marranos. Okay, fine. I mean, Marrano is the word of for those people who practiced their Judaism in secret and were Roman Catholic outside. So there they were. So there was a level of deception, okay? And in fact, the people who lived around never thought they were very good Muslims. They always had a feeling that off there in their encampment somewhere, do you understand? They did strange things. You couldn't really rely on them, okay? And then they moved from Iran. They moved into an area which is on the border of Iraq, and then they split. And this is a very famous split in the gypsy world. They had two ways they could go. They could head northwest into Europe, or they could head southeast into Egypt and North Africa. So, like Robert Frost, you take your choice. They made their choice, and one group actually went southeast. They went southeast into Iraq, and from Iraq to Jordan and Palestine, or what today is Jordan and Israel, and then into Egypt, and then all the way across North Africa, and then they crossed over into Spain. Now, their language is the Domba language. It's from Sanskrit, and these people are not called Romani, they're called Domari. In Spain, if you go to Andalusia, or Andalusia, or whatever, to the Alhambra and Seville and whatever, the gypsies in southern Spain are called gitanos. They're not Romani. They come from the people who took the southeastern route and came across North Africa into southern Spain. And we're not talking about them today because the Domari aren't part of the story of Europe. The other group headed northwest. Their first stop is Armenia. Armenia used to be a large country in what today is eastern Turkey. Today it's just a small little thing on the border of eastern Turkey, but it used to be larger. And we know that they spent time in Armenia because there are many Armenian words in Romani. And then from Armenia, they moved across Anatolia, and they reached the borders of the Christian world. At that time, the capital of the Eastern Christian world, the Greek Orthodox Church, was Constantinople, and they crossed over into the Balkans. Somewhere at the end of the 13th century, somewhere around 1270 or 1280, they enter into the Balkans. And then they have to make another choice. This world doesn't like Muslims, they like what? Christians. So they kept their old religion in secret, and they what? They then openly practiced Christianity, this combination. But now they are in Europe, and these are the Romani. These are the people who enter Europe somewhere around 1280, and they enter in fairly large numbers because writers suddenly talk about their presence. By the 1300 or 1325 or 1350, people in Southeast Europe are talking about where did they come from? Who are these people? They arrived. In time, they were to move into other parts of Eastern Europe. They moved up into Hungary and into Poland, entered into what today is the Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. And that became their center in Europe. But already, by the 15th century, you find them in Germany and France. And they've even crossed over into England. Shakespeare knew about the gypsies. They had arrived. But they were most thickly settled in the Balkans. Now, the gypsies, or the Romani, along the way developed a culture. So let me try to tell you about this culture. First, it was a nomadic culture. So gypsies moved as a segregated group. They were always on the move, from place to place. And they went in caravans, like covered wagons. And the wagons were pulled by horses because they were experts in the horse trade. So, and they moved from place to place. They did not have any settled place. They were simply on the move. That was the culture. So they would appear in one village, then another village, and then another village. They were divided up into tribes. Often, each tribe had a specialty. They often were what we call multi-skilled, but they had specialties. One tribe was a specialist in smithing, metals. One tribe was a specialist in breeding. One tribe was a specialist in what we call music and entertaining. They had a distinctive costume, which always featured breeches and boots. Boots are very important. You got to have boots. And it wasn't because it was snowing. It was part of the costume that they had. There were always horses. Their diet, well, their food, they ate a lot of fowl, and they often caught wild animals. One of their favorite delicacies, I've never eaten it, is hedgehog. And sort of a rodent-like creature, and it's one of the gypsy delicacies. One of the things they loved was things that were sweet. They liked sweets, and there wasn't cane sugar at that time, so obviously there was the availability of honey, whatever it is, but the sweet tooth of the gypsy is very important in terms of the gypsy diet. They were waterless. They rarely used water except for drinking. And the reason is very clear. They came from a country which did not allow them to enter into any stream to wash. They were outcasts. If they entered into the water turned polluted. The very fact that they used the water polluted the water, so they had to build their culture around not using, I mean, you can't live without water, but they didn't use water, and of course then that became an accusation on the part of the people who lived outside, who didn't understand why they didn't, and after many, many centuries when they could have entered streams, they didn't enter streams because that was their culture. The culture that had been built and reinforced certainly in India. They generally practiced two religions. A private religion, which featured some of the Hindu gods. The favorite one is my favorite god in India. Not that my favorite means anything, all right. She's a fierce lady. Many arms and fierce face, but if she's your friend, don't tangle with her, she'll protect you. Her name is Kali. And I used to say people who follow Kali are Kali followers, but no. No. One of the most important cities in India is named after her. Calcutta. And Calcutta is named after the goddess Kali. So she's one of what we call the private figures. But the outer religion of the gypsy is always what the prevailing religion is in the area. That's how they're outcasts. That's how they survive. So if you're in Iran, you're what? You're a Muslim. If you're in central Bulgaria, you are Christian. And then when the Muslim Turks conquered the Balkans after the 15th century, the gypsies had a problem because most of the people around them were Christian, but the rulers were Muslim, so you have a mixture. Some of the gypsies are Muslim, but most of the gypsies remain Christian because they have to deal with Christian audiences. One of the characteristics of gypsy culture is deception. Now, one of the accusations made against gypsies is lying. If I were a gypsy in enemy territory, I wouldn't tell the truth either. Do you understand? Because to tell the truth is only to expose yourself. So they were famous for lying, that you could never trust what they said. It was part of their defense in an environment where everybody despised and hated them. Certainly, one of the characteristics was the importance of family. Even in this last century, in the 20th century, when in Poland a gypsy was arrested for committing a crime of violence and was about to be executed. The clan got together and they contacted the authorities and said, no, the person you're going to execute is too important to us. We have somebody else to give you. I mean, no. Do you understand? It's the family. What you do is you punish the family by taking somebody from the family. There isn't individual guilt, there is collective guilt. So who cares whom you execute as long as you execute somebody from the family? Okay, fine. One of the things about the culture is illiteracy. The gypsies were not into any literate culture. There are no great written epic stories. I mean, there's no written culture. Romani is simply a spoken language. They were outcasts given what they did. There was no need for writing. And there was no tradition of teaching anybody how to read or write. In fact, the Romani language doesn't even have original words for reading and writing. Now, obviously, there are oral tales, but it's a culture without scripture. Do you understand? Without literature. If there is any kind of gypsy literature, it was created at the end of the 20th century. Spoken word? Yes. One of the characteristics of the culture was chiefs. That is, families were united into clans. Every clan had a chief. Clans were united into tribes. Every tribe had a what? Had a kind of chief. The idea of kings, we often hear about the gypsy king, the gypsy prince. That's a modern invention for public relations. That is not characteristic of what we call the historic gypsy world. One of the characteristics of the world is early marriage. Marriages were arranged, and often girls were married at the ages of 12 or 13 and bore children right away. So the characteristic of early marriage. One of the things is disorder. That is, the gypsies come out of a world where they were not allowed to touch anything because they would pollute it, right? They were outcasts. So if you go inside a gypsy house, a traditional one, then it's very neat and clean. But outside, that's what, it's strewn with garbage. You don't touch the things outside because the things outside are dangerous to touch because you might, by your touch, pollute them, or as it's later rationalized, you may be polluted by touching. So it's an environment of disorder, which is one of the major accusations against gypsies moving into the neighborhood, that the garbage, what? Is strewn all over the place. And the last, because they come out of the caste system, is segregation. Gypsies marry what? Gypsies. Gypsies don't have strong or intense relationships with non-gypsies. And that was enforced. It came out of the Indian culture from which they came, the life of the Domba. So this culture was already firmly in place when they arrived in Europe. Now, once they arrived in Europe in large numbers, they developed a lot of hostility. They were a kind of provocation. And what happened was that people developed ambivalent attitudes toward them. On the one hand, did you need a blacksmith or a tinsmith? Yes. Would you enjoy entertainment, music and dancing? The answer is yes. Would you like a fortune teller from time to time? The answer is yes. On the other hand, these dark strangers in caravans show up. Now you have to understand that one of the genetic fears that we have, all of us have it, because it had survival value through most of human evolution, is the fear of strangers. The fear of strangers is not simply culturally induced. The fear of strangers is most likely genetically there. And it's protective. An intruder arrives, right? So they're always intruding, aren't they? They're strangers who are always arriving by caravan. So they arouse this hostility. So on the one hand, they're useful. On the other hand, they're what? Strangers. And so one day you're being nice to them, and the next day what? You're hitting them and killing them and driving them out. And the story, certainly of the Romani in Europe, was that they were frequently expelled. Already in the 15th and 16th century, in Central and Western Europe, in Germany, France, and England, where they are not numerous, there are all these laws passed telling them not to show up. I mean, one of the things that happens when you fear people, fear strangers, is that you invent stories. When I was a child, before World War II, I was always told to be careful of gypsies. There were gypsies that moved around, to be careful of the gypsies because they will kidnap you. Do you remember that story? Am I the only one who heard that story? No. I mean, people, even the mothers of liberals, radicals, passed on these stories, this fear, and it was all reinforced by what we call the fear of strangers. They were the ultimate stranger because they were nomads. If somebody strange walks into your neighborhood, I remember when I decided when I was in Beverly Hills the first time to become a pedestrian. And I walked down the street and somebody called the police. Because a stranger walking down a street in Beverly Hills is what? Is an intruder. First of all, nobody's a pedestrian. Is anybody a pedestrian? No. That already means you don't belong in Beverly Hills. If you're walking, you already don't belong in Beverly Hills. So, and then I was an intruder. So the fear of strangers, the fear of intruders, I mean, is always there. So there was all this expulsion, continuous expulsion. But for the gypsies, so you get expelled from one place, you go to what? You go to another. And there was also enslavement in Romania in the 15th century. In Romania, the Romanians enslaved gypsies. There were large numbers of gypsies that came up into the Balkans. Today, the largest gypsy entity in Europe is in Romania. Some 2.5 million of the 8 million gypsies are in Romania. And when I say enslaved, they weren't turned into workers of the soil. You can't turn a gypsy into a farmer easily. But what if you want a blacksmith or you want a tinsmith who works for nothing? So you what? You enslave them and they're forced to live with you. They preserve most of their lifestyle, but not all of their lifestyle, and you abuse them while you have them. In fact, gypsy slavery continued in Romania until the middle of the 19th century. One of the ways, certainly, that they coped with all of this was they continued to be nomads. Isn't that a coping strategy? Meaning, if you're kicked out of one place, you go to another. One of the ways they coped, certainly with this persecution, was they tried to be as useful as possible. If they would be useful, then people would at least tolerate them. The third, and it's very important, is they developed no ambition with regard to the world in which they moved. That is, the gypsies never wanted to be bishops, lawyers, doctors, whatever, because, what? It would be a waste of time. For them, what they wanted to do was to please the elders in their family and the elders in their tribe. So I call it the no ambition of pariah peoples, peoples who are what? Discarded. If you have ambition, you'll only have frustration. You'll have a heart attack. If you have no ambition, then you can what? You can survive. I don't have any ambition. All I want to do is to survive today. I want my family to survive. That's okay. So I'll dance, I'll sing, I'll do whatever else it is. I don't have to be the Lord. So they developed various strategies for surviving in this environment, and in fact, in Europe, they experienced much of the hostility that they had experienced in India, which they had chosen to leave. Now, once the 18th and 19th century arrived, the gypsies confronted major challenges which they confront today, and it's very difficult to understand their challenges because we have totally surrendered to what we call the culture of the modern Western world. But the gypsies had a different culture. And now the modern world arrives. And the modern world features cities. All right. When you're in India and you are the Domba, you go from village to village, right? And you bring your caravan. So now you've got Chicago. So you got your covered wagon and your horses, do you understand? And you're coming up Michigan, I mean, how does this life, do you understand? How does this lifestyle fit into the culture? It fits into the other culture, right? There's a rutted road and you go from village to village to village to village. And the horses and the covered wagons fit. They don't fit in an urban environment. They didn't fit into London already in the 18th century. They didn't fit into Detroit when I was a child. They found empty lots somewhere. I mean, they were totally incongruous with the environment. The second, of course, is the arrival of government. You know, you have to realize in the Middle Ages, what was the government? They had road signs. They said, do not park. Do not camp. Now we live in a world which is what? The government now takes over the whole environment. There are rules and regulations. Do not sit here. Do not camp here. You may not use this for toilet purpose. There are all these rules and regulations. Now, how does a wandering people live in a world in which the government now produces all these rules and regulations? One of the challenges, certainly, was by the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, in order to survive in this new urban culture, you have to be able to read. There are all these road signs, right? Street signs. So now you got your caravan. And now you're what? Turn left, turn right. I mean, yeah, how do you function in this world if you're illiterate? And suddenly illiteracy becomes a penalty. One of the great challenges, certainly for them, was that by the 19th century, with the rise of literacy, there now developed in Europe, which was becoming less and less religious, a new force built around language that we call nationalism. So now I'm in Romania, and now I'm a Romanian nationalist, and now I've got these what? These foreigners here speaking a strange language. They don't belong here. I'm a Pole, and I'm 100% Polish. And I want Poland to be independent and free and whatever else it is. And they what? They got these foreigners here. So the gypsies now find themselves as hated foreigners who will not conform, because there are some liberal Poles and liberal Romanians who say to the gypsies, look, but they said to all the immigrants that came to America, if you'll learn Polish and become a Polish citizen, do you understand, then we'll love you. But the gypsies don't want to learn Polish, and they don't want to what? They don't want to become a Polish citizen. They just want to preserve their lifestyle. What if immigrants came to America, got off the boat and said, we don't want to learn English. We just want to live our own life, run our own life, sing and dance for you, and that's it. And not pay taxes. Well, I mean, even liberals would get what? No, they might get it. What liberals are willing to do is to say, we're willing to welcome you into our group. But we're not willing to allow you to maintain these islands, do you understand, of separate culture in our midst. So now the gypsy position became even more provocative. And then there arrived what we call the reformers. Conservatives call them the do-gooders. Do-gooder arrives at gypsy camp. Ugh, disgusting, dirty, filthy. They can't read, they can't write, the whole thing. And look at their parents. Their parents are lazy. They don't care about their future. They have no ambition. They don't want their children to have any ambition. So what we need to do is to what? We need to clean the act up. Get rid of the garbage. Bring gypsy parents into little classes where we would teach them about parenting, how to take care of their children, how to teach them English or French or German or whatever. And the main program of the reformers was this nomadic lifestyle doesn't work anymore. If people want entertainment, they go downtown or the local theater. They don't need little gypsy caravans wandering through their village. So what we need to do is to stop them from wandering. Settle them down, give them nice apartments, give them good education. Got it? Sounds nice. But you have to understand, and this is what it was so difficult for many of the do-gooders. The gypsies looked at them and said, we don't want an apartment. we don't want to go to school. Do you understand? We have a culture. Our culture is what? No school and wandering. You don't like it? That's your culture. This is our culture. But so even the liberals get what? Get furious. Even communists got furious. What do you mean? I'm telling you, do you understand, what progress is? And you're telling me you don't want to be part of progress? Now you see the unique nature of what we call the gypsy problem. In most cases, the people wanted education, wanted what? Wanted apartments, wanted all these things, but there was no money for them or nobody would give it to them or they were oppressed. In the gypsy case, it wasn't simply that they were asking for these things and in fact mean conservative governments wouldn't give it to them. It was what? They didn't want it. Just let us what? We got our caravans, we got our thing, we have our culture, just let us go and do it. In the liberal manual, there was no chapter. There was no chapter for how to deal with people who talk like that, because it isn't what they're supposed to say. What they're supposed to say is, we want all this progress, but we can't have it. But if you'll help us, that's great. Well, what happened, therefore, to gypsy culture is very interesting. In Eastern Europe, where the gypsies, the Romani, were centered, once the industrial urban age arrived, even in places where the urban industrial age wasn't very well advanced, and it wasn't very well advanced in southeastern Europe, but it was sufficiently advanced to create the problem, there now developed widespread unemployment. There was a time when people relied on what we call passing worker. Do you remember? I still remember. There'd be people, peddlers. Remember the peddlers? They would come by, and you'd go out and buy your vegetables on the street. But in the world of the supermarket, I mean, things have what? I mean, things have changed. So now, many of the skills that gypsies had, nobody wanted. And they didn't want them in the places where they were served. And they didn't like the way they received the service now, because now they wanted a clean store, they wanted a bill, they wanted a receipt. I mean, it didn't work. The second was that now that they were unemployed, what they decided to do, this wasn't intrinsic to gypsy life. They decided to beg. It often happens with poor people, right? They went begging. Now that they were unemployed, now that their skills were not needed in this urban world, they were out on the streets begging, adults with children. The most convincing way to beg. I'm going to give a course on begging because, not that I lecture beggars, but I find now in many cities there are young grown men who look healthy, who stand in the middle of the street and saying, "Give me some money." So I say to them, if you want money, you can't get money looking like that. The best scene for begging is a mother holding a child. I mean, there is, because children, arouse the greatest amount of sympathy. So generally what you have, and you see this with gypsy beggars, you have the mother and she has she's cradling a little baby. And is there poverty? Of course there's poverty. And there are the children, and initially, of course, it's very seductive. The third is very clear. It happens among the poor. It's not intrinsic to gypsy culture. It happened in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. It's called crime, doesn't it? They turned from begging to stealing. And since they were alienated culturally from the environments where they operated, well, I mean, there it is. So now there's crime. One of the transformations, however, was they ended up living in cities. And that created a trauma. Where do you park the caravan? Try to imagine parking a caravan in Manhattan. I mean, it's $1,000 a minute. No, this whole, what do you do with your culture? I mean, where do you put it? So already, starting in the late 19th century, one of the things that happened to gypsies was that they settled down. I mean, the only choice was to what? Settle down. They generally settled down with a group of gypsy families and the chief, and they tried to get a job somewhere. All right? Settlement. Now, there's nothing in their culture, historically, that was attached to living in a fixed place at any time. Let me just talk about garbage. One of the things I notice with people who are driving, and it really annoys me, the window is open. Do you ever see this? And out of it comes milk containers, Coke bottles, cans. Do you ever see? Am I the only person who sees that? Because if you're not living in the place, you tend to what? Dirty it up. People just do that. They would not drop that Coke can next to their own house. But if they're driving on the road, they just open the window and they what? They throw it out. So what happens is, if you are a wandering people, you what? As you're moving along, you throw your garbage, like ships moving at sea, right? And so you do. So now you've moved into what we call a settled environment, and in the settled environment, you are what? You're doing the same.